A machine is an apparatus that allows you to move a specific amount of weight through a specific range of motion. There are a few basic components to a machine that we'll go over now. First is the positioning apparatus, which for this machine is a seat. The quad extension machine is a seat. Most machines will have you sit, some will have you stand, some will have you lay down. Next is the weight stack itself. You can adjust this by pulling the pin out, putting it into a different weight. And of course, in a lot of these, you'll have a cord or something that attaches to a point. This is a circular thing. I forgot the name for this. But then you have the handle. I put a decent bit of weight on here, which right here would be this pad. And that's what you grab onto. This is pressing up against my shins, and I'm doing the range of motion here, or I'm moving it through a specific path. And this path would be an arc. For some, it would be a straight line. Also, another thing to mention is this is an isolation machine, which means only using one joint. I'm only using the knee joint. For some machines, you will end up doing a compound movement, which means you're using more than one joint. But for some, for a lot of machines, you're just using one joint, so you're doing an isolation movement. And for this machine in particular, the isolation is focused on the quad up here. And to just go over the setup basics, you have the weight. You want to start off by choosing what weight you want to do. You may have to experiment with this and see how many you can do for however many reps you want to do that for. Obviously, if I loaded this up, if I put 200 on here, I'm not going to be able to move that weight. So you have to experiment a little bit with that. Next, you have to assume the position. I might also mention you can look up here on most machines. They'll generally have a description and some pictures of how the movement is supposed to look. So this one, my legs are straight and then they are bent. This is an isolation exercise with that knee joint being the only joint involved and the muscles being worked out being the hamstrings. So I'm gonna get on here and see if we can move this. Oh, okay. So you assume the position and then you execute the lift. That was not through full range of motion. Generally, you do want to go through full range of motion as well. On most machines, you will have the ability to adjust the extent of the path, the extent of the range of motion. So on here, we have this, which allows us to change the length of the moment arm and make it longer. So if I have longer legs, I can put it out here. If I have shorter legs, I can put it here, or, do something reasonable in the middle. This allows me to change how long the range of motion is, how much range of motion I'm getting. So my legs would be more stretched here. My hamstrings would be more stretched here. My hamstrings would be less stretched there, as you can imagine. Now let's go through all of the basic everyday use machines and see how we actually want to use them and what muscles are involved.
A good cue to keep in mind when using all the machines that we will talk about is when the muscle group you're working out is lengthening or you're doing the eccentric part of the lift, you want to do that slow and controlled. So in this example that we're looking at, when you're doing a bicep curl, the eccentric portion is when you're lowering the weight down. So you want that to be slow and controlled. The concentric portion of that lift, or when you're shortening the muscle, can be faster and more explosive. This is the quad extension machine, and I'm just showing you the shortest range of motion here. So I've set it to the absolute shortest range of motion at the adjustment site, and now I'm going to set it to the largest range of motion. So we're going to get the most stretch in the quads. And the positioning for this is seated. And because this is an isolation exercise only involving the knee joint, the muscles being worked out are the quads or the front portion of the top of the legs. This is the hamstring curl machine. This is done in the prone position. This is an isolation exercise only involving the knee joint, and the muscles being worked here are the hamstrings or the back part of the top of the leg. There are two variations in which you can do this exercise. You can do it holding the handles, or you can prop yourself up with your forearms, which makes the exercise harder because you can only pull with your hamstrings. You're unable to pull yourself forward with your arms. In particular, with this exercise, you want to squeeze so the pad comes all the way up and touches your hamstrings, and then lower it down slowly. This is the leg press machine. This exercise is done in a seated position. It is a compound movement involving the knee and hip joint. It works the upper part of the legs, both front and rear, as well as the butt. You can also see that this movement is done in a straight line along a track, and the way you release and rack the weight is with these handles on the side. If you can imagine doing a squat but bent over, this is the exact same movement. You don't want your feet too high or too low on the plate. You want to be able to go through the full range of motion without having any pain in your knees or your lower back. One last thing to keep in mind is you want to make sure your feet are staying flat on the plate. You want to imagine you're pushing through the middle of your foot, so between the ball of your foot and your heel. This is the Smith machine. It's a barbell connected to a straight track. What I am loading the bar for right now is squats, but you can do any number of things on a Smith machine, from upright rows to bench press to lunges. The possibilities are vast, and the advantage to using the Smith machine is because it can be considered a little bit safer. It has catchers along either side of the machine. Admittedly, I don't use the machine at all. The exercise I'm doing right now is just an example of one of the many exercises you could do on this machine. I'm doing squats, which require you to take a standing position. This is a compound movement involving the knee and the hip. So this exercise involves the top of the leg, the front and back, as well as the butt and the lower back. And something to keep in mind is when you are doing a squat, you want your butt to go back first, and you want to make sure that you are standing upright, keeping your lower back very straight. This is the plate-loaded calf raise machine. The positioning is seated. This is an isolation movement involving the ankle joint exclusively, and this works out the calves as well as the soleus, or the muscle underneath the calves. And the two things you want to focus on when doing this movement is getting a good squeeze at the top and getting a good stretch at the bottom. We're back to the leg press machine to do calf raises. This is actually my preference. This is in the seated position, only involves the one ankle joint, and you are only hitting calves in this exercise. The stretch and squeeze tips given in the calf raise machine section apply here as well. And there's no need to unrack the weight when doing these unless you're fairly short. This is a cable machine, but it is primarily used for lat pull downs, and these are done in the seated position. This is a compound movement. It involves the shoulder and elbow joints, and it primarily works out the back and biceps. A good cue for this exercise is to make your chest really big and to pull the bar down to it, almost like you're squeezing something in the middle of your back. This machine is the assisted pull-up machine. You can decide how much assistance you'd like. This is in the standing or upright position. The joints involved are elbow and shoulder, so it is a compound movement. A good cue for this exercise is to make your chest really big and pull your chest up to the bar, and imagine you're squeezing something in the middle of your back. The muscle groups worked are your back and biceps. This is the assisted tricep dip machine. This is done in the standing position. It's a compound movement involving the shoulder and elbow joints, and the muscles worked are the triceps and chest. You want to try to keep your body as perpendicular to the ground as possible. Although you can have a slight forward tilt, you really just don't want this to turn into a push-up like exercise where you're mainly working out the chest. You also want to make sure that your elbows don't flare out. You want to keep your arms relatively close to your body. They can go as far out as 45 degrees from your body. Generally, parallel dip bars will have two settings, a more narrow setting and a wider setting. And in my experience, having the handles in a more narrow position makes the full range of motion more comfortable. This is the close grip seated cable row. The positioning is seated. This is a compound movement involving the shoulder and elbow joints, and this works primarily the entire back as well as the biceps. And you have a couple options for how you want to do this exercise. You can either pull lower towards your belly button / stomach, and that's going to exercise more of your mid to lower back, or you can pull higher towards the bottom of your chest, and that's going to work primarily the upper part of your back. And a good cue for this is you want to imagine you're pulling your elbows behind you, or there's a string attached to both of your elbows going directly behind you. This is the bench press or chest press machine. This is in the seated position and involves two joints, the shoulder and elbow joints, and this works the chest, shoulders, and triceps. This is maybe the most classic of all movements. If you've ever done a push-up before, the movement should follow that same pattern. You want to keep your arms at a 45-degree angle from your torso. Bring your hands to your chest and push them back out. This is the fly machine. You can utilize this machine to not only do chest flies, but to do back flies as well. The machine is incredibly adjustable, allowing you to get as much of a range of motion as you'd like. For both exercises, you're in a seated position, and for both exercises, it is an isolation exercise involving only the shoulder joint. When doing chest flies, the chest muscles are working, and when doing back flies, the rotator cuff muscles as well as center upper back muscles and rear delts. A good cue for both of these exercises is you want to have your arms in a semi-neutral position. You don't have to have them all the way locked out. So at the elbow joint, you can have a little bend, but what you don't want to do is have any movement in that elbow joint, because you'll end up turning it into, instead of an isolation movement, a compound movement. This is the plate-loaded seated overhead press machine. The positioning is seated. It's a compound shoulder and elbow movement, and it's working the shoulders as well as the triceps. Something to keep in mind about this, and with any seated overhead press type movement, is you want to make sure that your butt doesn't slide forward, because the movement will turn into more of a bench press or chest dominant exercise versus a shoulder exercise, which is what we're going for. This machine is the preacher curl machine. It's done in the seated position. It's an isolation movement about the elbow, and the muscles worked are the biceps. A few things to focus on here are you want to have your arms about shoulder width apart, and you want to make sure you're going down slowly, and when you come up, you want to squeeze at the top. This is the tricep dip machine or tricep push down machine. It's in the seated position. It's a compound movement involving the shoulder and elbow joints, and the muscles worked are the triceps, and secondary muscles are the chest. A couple things to keep in mind while utilizing this machine is you want to keep your arms close to your body through the full range of motion, and you can also decide what grip you want to have, considering the handle for this machine gives you that option. This machine is an adjustable cable machine, but is going to be used for cable tricep extensions. It's in the standing position. It's an isolation movement about the elbow, and the muscles worked are the triceps. A very important cue to keep in mind here is you want to make sure that your torso and the upper portion of your arm don't move while you are going through the range of motion.